with the Fox News alert this morning. The threat from Iran's nuclear program growing right now. Despite UN sanctions, Iranian and Russian engineers are now loading fuel into Iran's first nuclear reactor. Caroline Shively is live in Washington with the very latest details. Good morning, Caroline.
Good morning to you, Dave. There are nationwide celebrations in Iran today as those loads of fuel cells are being taken to the country's first nuclear reactor. Over the next 2 weeks, 80 tons of uranium fuel will be moved into that reactor, with the UN's nuclear watchdog group watching the entire process. The plant is set to produce electricity by next month, and according to Iran, that's all they plan to do with it. But critics don't trust the Iranian regime, saying with some modifications, this plant could eventually build a nuclear bomb. Under the current contract, these fuel cells will be imported from Russia to the plant, and once those rods are used, they'll be sent back to Russia. Iran says that's proof they're not trying to build a bomb. But the bigger worry for many analysts is Iran's plan to build 10 new uranium enrichment sites inside mountains across the country. That's part of what has gotten Iran the UN sanctions. At one time, the U.S. was trying to block this new power plant as a way to put pressure on Iran to stop these separate enrichment sites, but there's no formal protest now. And here's another concern. On Friday, the president's top advisor on nuclear issues said U.S. intelligence believes Iran is roughly a year from a nuclear weapon. That's a big switch from most estimates, which had put it at 3 to 5 years.
Now, if Israel plans to attack Iran's nuclear power plant in Bushehr, it has only 3 days left to do so. Well, that's the view of a former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. John Bolton made the statement in an interview with Fox News.
All right, Israel has just days to attack Iran before it puts the finishing touches on one of its nuclear facilities. That is the stark warning that my next guest, former UN Ambassador John Bolton, issued yesterday.
From Israel's point of view, if they were going to do anything militarily about Bushehr, they've only got a few days until the fuel rods are inserted. Their problem is, of course, they've got the rest of Iran's nuclear weapons program, the uranium enrichment facilities and so on, to worry about too. And I don't think Israel has the luxury to attack in the next few days, wait a few months and attack again.
If the Israelis deem that this is necessary, and as you point out, it's necessary to do this before there would be fallout of this Bushehr reactor, are you thinking there's a possibility Israel may in fact do this?
Well, I think it's a remote possibility.
As we look at the country of Iran, though, and where their nuclear facilities are, I mean, it is spread all throughout the country. The risk for the Israeli military would be enormous because they've got to be able to penetrate deep into Iran at numerous locations. They'd need to do it, I would assume, simultaneously. There are refueling issues that they would face. Do you think this is even operationally possible for them to pull off in terms of taking out all the facilities they need to take out?
I think it is. I think it's a very difficult, very risky mission. I wish we weren't at this point. I think, frankly, the United States ought to help Israel do this. We're going to get blamed for it anyway if it happens.
Moscow says the plant poses no threat as it will be operating for peaceful purposes under the control of the UN nuclear watchdog. But investigative journalist and RT contributor Wayne Madsen says this might not prevent Israel from launching a strike.
If the Israelis decide to attack Iran, it doesn't matter whether there's civilian volunteers over there or the New York Yankees happen to be in Tehran. None of that's going to matter. They're going to hit Iran, and people like John Bolton, he's one of these old neocon types. They're the ones who lied about intelligence to get us into the Iraq War, and they continue to hype up intelligence, cook it. They provide false information, and Bolton is keying everything to this August 21st date. The Bushehr reactor is a peaceful power reactor. It has nothing to do with weapons production.
Peter, this is the site of the 9/11 terrorist attacks.
Oh, so Saddam Hussein did this?
No.
The Iraqi army?
No.
Some guys from Iraq?
No.
That one lady who visited Iraq that one time?
No, Peter, Iraq had nothing to do with this. It was a bunch of Saudi Arabians, Lebanese, and Egyptians financed by a Saudi Arabian guy living in Afghanistan and sheltered by Pakistanis.
So you're saying we need to invade Iran?
Now, files declassified in America have revealed covert public relations and lobbying activities of Israel in the U.S. The National Archive made the documents public following a Senate investigation. They suggest Israel has been trying to shape media coverage of issues it regards as important.
These files are from a sealed Senate investigation, which was the result of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the U.S. Department of Justice looking into groups that brought $36 million into the U.S. to plant stories in the U.S. media and promote Israeli foreign policy objectives in the United States. They're extremely relevant because they revealed, for example, a vast effort to divert U.S. attention from the Israeli Dimona nuclear weapons facility by saying it was merely a research center. They carefully tracked how that story was playing in the U.S. media. And they also were using outlets such as The Atlantic magazine, funneling $50,000 into that magazine in a major effort to disrupt a U.S. peace proposal, which would have involved bringing some Palestinian refugees and allowing them to return to their homes and properties in Israel. We're replaying history. Now, instead of trying to divert attention away from nuclear weapons in the Middle East, a magazine, again, The Atlantic, is on the forefront of an AIPAC drive to get the United States to attack Iran's nuclear facilities, again, now under the pretext that they're nuclear weapons sites. So for the United States, it's extremely important for people to see this media influence and the mechanics of it, because over the passage of time, this has only gotten worse.
What does this suggest about U.S. policy in the Middle East? Is it being shaped around the interest of Israel as you see it?
The documentary record suggests a heavy influence on the part of Israeli politicians and various parastatal groups that work tightly with Israel without disclosing those relationships. They have successfully built a campaign financing system in the United States that's extremely effective at pushing Israeli objectives by withholding or dispersing campaign funding to U.S. politicians. So there is a high degree of control that's in place, but for your average American, it's almost completely hidden.
And this kind of manipulation of the American media is very disturbing. The groups that are pushing the U.S. to invade Iran or to certainly attack Iran, either financially or physically, are the same groups that pushed the U.S. to invade Iraq. Their agenda is to make Americans fear and hate Arabs and Muslims, and also, I fear, to make Muslims and Arabs fear and hate Americans.
Better to solve the United States' economic problems than finding a way to cut $1 trillion in spending. Could it really be that easy? Well, Congressman Ron Paul and Barney Frank seem to think so. They've drafted a letter to President Obama's Commission of Fiscal Responsibility and Reform outlining ways to alter this country's enormous military budget. And joining me now to discuss this is radio host Adam Kokesh. So Adam, you were in the military yourself. From your perspective and your experience, is it possible to cut military spending and not jeopardize national security and have enough to support the troops?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's really the point of this letter, and what it gets into is how you can do that. Asking the Presidential Commission on Fiscal Responsibility to cut $1 trillion from the military budget, which is certainly doable without compromising national security. I mean, the war in Iraq has already cost us $3.5 trillion. We know that a large chunk of that has been lost to waste, fraud, and abuse.
Now you have this letter from a Republican and a Democrat, and it seems like people from both sides of the aisle are actually agreeing that maybe the first logical place to cut is the military budget. Right now it only has 10 signatories. Do you think it will actually get a lot of support?
Well, I'm really glad that this is being demonstrated to be a nonpartisan issue. It's not something that falls among left-right ideologues, but really rather along whether you believe in fiscal responsibility in government or not. Clearly, the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned us about has grown completely out of control. And this is something that Ron Paul has championed for decades, and it's great to see that he is finding colleagues on the other side of the aisle who, like Barney Frank, aren't really challenging the fiscal issues underneath this, the Federal Reserve, and how we fund wars through inflation in the first place. But it's certainly exciting to see that we have, one reason to count Barney Frank slightly less annoying. And I really do respect him for this. And I respect, all the members of Congress that are standing up to that military-industrial complex.